Welcome to the show. This story of Spanish Florida begins after the attack on Saint Augustine by Sir Francis Drake in 1585. Drake swept through with 42 ships and around 2,000 men. The 300 to 400 or so people in the Saint Augustine area didn't stand a chance. The English quickly took the unfinished fort outside of the city, and the population fled to the north and hid out in the ruins of Fort San Mateo, while Drake burned the city and the surrounding farm fields to the ground. After this, Drake sails north to Santa Elena, defended only by a serviceable cedar fort. Luckily for the Spanish, Drake didn't want to bother navigating through the shoals and sandbars and lost interest, leaving further north for the English colony of Roanoke, as we covered in our last episode. The whole of Spanish Florida was now reduced to a couple hundred displaced individuals and one wooden fort. 21 years of hard-earned progress wiped away in a few short days. After this, as you can imagine, many who had the means to do so moved away, but a sturdy few remained under the guidance of their governor, Pedro Menendez Marquez, a man who tried twice previously to retire, only remaining at his post on a rumor of English privateers in the Caribbean, rumors now violently confirmed. Drake's goal seemed very clear. He wanted to pillage as much of the Spanish New World as possible, but another Englishman named Sir Richard Grenville came peacefully to the settlement of La Isabela on the island of Hispaniola in 1585, and he told the local governor there that he was planting a colony for the English on an island. We now know this was the first colony placed on Roanoke Island. Governor Marquez's uncle, the great Pedro Menendez, founded St. Augustine and Spanish Florida, for that matter, as a defensive outpost for the Spanish Empire, guarding the east coast of North America from foreign privateers and colonies. And so here in 1586, Governor Marquez again declines to retire and instead goes about rebuilding Spanish Florida in anticipation of a conflict with the English and their secret colony. Governor Marquez now faces some tough decisions, and he decides to concentrate all his resources to rebuilding St. Augustine, which meant that the fort at Santa Elena and the small soldier-owned farms outside of the fort would have to be abandoned. And so, a year after Drake burned St. Augustine, Governor Marquez burns Santa Elena, destroying anything that could not be moved so as not to leave resources for unseen rivals. Spanish Florida is now down to a single settlement of Spaniards, surrounded by a number of native tribes that pay tribute. The soldiers of Santa Elena are now posted at St. Augustine. Any property they had to forfeit in the process was compensated. A hard choice to make, but Governor Marquez was correct in concentrating his sparse population. This would be an era of lowered expectations. When Pedro Menendez founded Spanish Florida in 1565, everything northward to the edge of Newfoundland seemed within the realm of possible control for the Spanish. Eventually, Menendez lowered his ambitions to extend Spanish Florida to the Appalachian Mountains and up to the Chesapeake after the massacre of the Jesuits by Pacuaquinio and then the slaughter of Juan Pardo's colonists. Menendez, after this, tempered his expectations down even more to just being a coastal colony and extending influence as far north as modern-day South Carolina. Now here in 1587, Governor Marquez hoped to just keep a single settlement protected on the Florida Peninsula. The Franciscan missionaries also lowered their horizons. After Drake's attack, they concentrated their efforts, and their northernmost mission remained at Santa Catalina, St. Catherine's Island in what is today the state of Georgia. All the Spanish could do now is quietly rebuild, hope to remain unseen, and gather any information they could on the secret English colony mentioned by Sir Richard Grenville. This is how the Spanish spent most of the year 1588, just hanging on as the Spanish Empire suffered the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English. Sir Drake received much of the credit for their victory. The Spanish New World was now more vulnerable than ever. And more than a new world, Europe just entered a new age, as the English were suddenly emboldened by the loss of the Armada. Spain and Portugal were world-spanning empires, but now it seemed like there was room for another. After 2 years of diligent rebuilding, Governor Marquez is called upon to command the Spanish treasure fleet. While his family created Spanish Florida, they were never really conquistadors or governors. They were navy men, and now more than ever, the empire needed Marquez at sea. He holds onto the title of governor, but never again returns to Florida. Now, Marquez often left Florida to obtain supplies, and he had a series of lieutenant governors in place to ensure the stability of the colony. This would continue until 1592, when the crown appoints Rodrigo de Huanco, the new governor of Florida. A resident official of the Florida colony, he was likely connected to the founding Menendez family through common in-laws, and a decent pick for governor overall. Unfortunately, he died in a shipwreck off the coast of Florida, along with the man most likely to be appointed in his stead, Juan de Posada, the treasurer of Florida, Marquez's interim governor and brother-in-law. A year later, Father Rodrigo Garcia de Trujillo retires from his post in Saint Augustine, one for which he held since the foundation of the city in 1565. And with this, the founding generation of Spanish Florida was both literally and figuratively washed away. The second generation of Floridanos suddenly found themselves to be the only adults in the room. I don't know how old you are, but it's a strange day when you realize you're the adult or the elder among a large group of people. And all those people you used to look to for guidance, well, they're gone. And with that, the leadership of Spanish Florida was off into the next generation. It would be Posada's son-in-law, Juan Menendez Marquez, a close relative of the former Governor Marquez, that would inherit Posada's position as treasurer. The Spanish Empire usually found it improper for a treasurer of a colony to be related to the governors or other officials within the same domain. But Florida was such a small, intricate family affair, at times such as these, it was impossible to find qualified residents without a familial connection, or at least the extended Menendez family would make it appear so, as they will continue to fill these positions for generations and pay themselves from the Situado, a yearly subsidy. The historian Amy Bushnell writes of the Menendez family and their situation here. The 16th century governors, who could be called the Asturian dynasty, filled the colony with family intrigues and profiteering. All of the officers, treasury officials included, were captains of the sea and war who could build a fort, command a warship, smuggle contraband cargo, or keep a double set of books. As such, the crown sought to do as it had done in her other colonies and make sure the governor would be a peninsular, specifically a man born in Spain without Jewish or Moorish blood, loyal to Spain and not entangled with the locals. To ensure this, governors would be cycled out every 5 or 6 years ideally, and in the case of Florida, essentially a military outpost, the governor himself would have to be a military man. However, these governors had such difficulty, and in some cases hesitation, to take a post in Florida, and worth mentioning such a high mortality rate once in the role, very often the colony had an interim governor who was a local. Such would be the case with Governor Domingo Martinez de Avendano, the first governor of Florida not connected to the Menendez family. He served less than 2 years, dying in office in 1595. All the officials under him having these previously mentioned ties, he spent his short tenure living under the mark of an interloper, and after his death, it was discovered he kept outgoing mail from the colony locked in his desk, particularly those of the Floridanos officials seeking to get rid of the governor. Despite the animosity, it is during this short time that Saint Augustine and Spanish Florida in general is more or less restored to its former condition as it was before Drake's attack in 1586. The fruit trees filled in the yards of Saint Augustine, the Spanish grew more native corn in their fields outside of the city, and the Franciscans recorded 1,500 native Catholics among their flock. After decades of failed expansion, the Franciscan missions of Florida were finally taking off. The Spanish governor here in Florida, in relation to the natives, served as a paramount chief over their subjected tribes. These tribes were expected to pay tribute in corn, and they expected the protection of the Spanish in return. The natives would understand this arrangement as a yearly agreement that would have to be renewed through ceremonial gift-giving. The Spanish, however, always took the most advantageous interpretation of these relationships and accepted these arrangements as eternal submissions to the King of Spain. Such would be the situation in the 1590s, as many of the Timucua were already tributaries to the Spanish, and now the Wale and the Ayas would come to submit. In 1595, the corn tribute was first due to Saint Augustine from the Wale. The Wale town of Talamato sends nothing. Let's just let that information fester for a minute because it will become important later. In 1596, the new governor Gonzalo Mendez de Canso leaves Cuba to take up residency in Florida. Months before, Mendez participated in the successful defense of San Juan, Puerto Rico, repelling the English under Sir Francis Drake, who dies a few weeks later from dysentery. Sir Drake, who was public enemy number one to the Floridanos and the Spanish Empire in general, was now dead, and the admiral who handed him his final defeat was now governor of Florida. Governor Mendez was a man who can combat the petty politics of local bureaucrats far better than the former governor, as well as protect Spanish Florida from external threats. And on that note, the Spanish around this time learned that the Roanoke colony, which they never managed to locate itself, became lost to the English. On every front, the future looked bright for the Spanish in Florida. But on his way from Cuba, Governor Mendez visits the towns of the Ayas people and distributed gifts along the way. In one of these towns, the chief requests the new governor send a Spaniard to live with them and become a translator between the two native groups. Once Governor Mendez arrives in Saint Augustine, he sends a man with 2 native guides to do just that. These 3 men were then killed by the Ayas and their allies, the Surukwa people. The governor quickly sent a force to retaliate, killing 60 Surukwa warriors and taking 54 women and children captive back to Saint Augustine. Several chiefs arrived with a party of 22 warriors in order to negotiate the release of the captives. Governor Mendez takes these men as well, and then a lot of them are distributed to the people of Saint Augustine to be used as servants. Involuntary servitude being awfully close to slavery, Governor Mendez was reprimanded for his actions, as native slavery was illegal within the Spanish Empire, and these people were eventually freed. This dark first chapter of the governor's tenure exposed the militant nature of the man, and also the fact that the native groups were not as subjected as previous governors had reported. But after this event, Governor Mendez received somewhere north of 22 different chiefs from the Cape Canaveral area all the way up into modern-day Georgia. Over the next year or so, they came to St. Augustine to pay homage to the new governor. And so after this, Mendez, who distributed gifts on his inbound trip, learned that dealing with the natives of Florida should perhaps involve more stick than carrot. But we can perhaps credit the Franciscans more with these chiefs visiting St. Augustine than the new governor, as it was the Franciscans who developed new methods for integrating into the power structures of their host villages. The Franciscan missions here were small affairs, sometimes with a single friar present, living in a native hut or small wooden building, nothing like the classic missions of the American Southwest. But the priest here would make sure to ally with the local chief, have the governor confirm the power of this chief, and make sure that all the Spanish trade goods and gifts would trickle down to the chief for his distribution among his people, further cementing the chief's power. In this way, the priest would become an asset to those in power and help the chief hold off his rivals. Also, the priest would serve as the connection between the tribe and the Spanish for their material goods, which created a practical reason for their presence. And the chief would have his subjects lay aside a field of corn to feed the priests. The Franciscans essentially filled the political role of the native medicine men that they were displacing. For the Franciscans, however, they were in Florida to convert natives, in an earnest effort, they believed, to save as many souls as possible from damnation. These were not the heavy-handed types associated with the Inquisition or earlier colonial times, but gentler men who allowed Catholicism and Spanish culture to seep into native folkways. Many times in their writings, they'll note how more effective and honest a conversion is made through association and persuasion rather than through force. Of course, this was not a perfect system, nor a codified one, and would break down often. Such would be the case in September of 1597, when Father Copra at the village of Talamato, the same village that declined to tribute corn 2 years prior, refuses to confirm the chief's heir as his successor, a young man who had taken on the Spanish name Don Juan. Father Copra refused to do so, citing the fact that Don Juan, true to his name, was a polygamist. Father Copra could not bring himself to support a chief in opposition to Catholic doctrine. Now, Don Juan himself already had a list of reasons not to like the Spanish. The historian Barcia, in his classic History of Florida, records that Don Juan objected to the Franciscans in their persistent effort to erase native culture where they saw fit, including the practices of their medicine men, their native dances and rituals that kept the spirits satisfied with their efforts. The denial of such things Don Juan believed was weakening his people. The rejection of Don Juan, based on how many wives he chose to have, was the last straw. Don Juan entered the mission of Father Copra, and while he knelt in prayer, cut the father's head off. He placed Copra's head on a spike and sent his followers to other Wale villages to urge the anti-Spanish faction of each village to do the same to their Franciscans. Don Juan himself travels to the village of Topaqui and informs Father Rodriguez that he was to die. For Rodriguez, this meant martyrdom, the ultimate culmination of a Christ-like life. But the bodily fear must have been palpable. The father asks if he could give a final mass and distribute his possessions to his flock. He was allowed to do so, and then he was killed. Fathers Amon and Antonio were murdered at Santa Catalina. Father Villascola is killed on his way to Asio from Saint Augustine. Father Francisco de Avila is spared martyrdom, and he is kept as a hostage. Don Juan now had roughly 7 different villages of the Wale united in their repulsion of the Franciscans. Their violent actions, they knew, meant war. A force allied with Don Juan marched on the village that could be found on St. Peter's Island to take the Franciscan there by force, but the local chief fought back, killing these invaders. A very ill Governor Mendez insists on leading 150 men into Gullah country himself to avenge the death of the Franciscans. They meet no resistance, and they burn down the towns and the cornfields of all of those who followed Don Juan. Now, the Wale towns here that denied Don Juan are understandably eager to prove their loyalty and reiterate their support for the governor. Likewise, Governor Mendez suspends the corn tribute to all loyal subjects, including the Gullah who did not rebel. For a little more than a year afterwards, the Spanish played a cat-and-mouse game chasing Don Juan and punishing those who harbored him. Finally, in January of 1599, most of the Gullah chiefs, as one united movement, banished Don Juan and his followers and sought a formal peace with the governor. Governor Mendez pardons all of the Gullah associated with these chiefs for any wrongdoings they might have committed during this time. And important for the natives here, he keeps the suspension of the corn tribute, no longer required. Poor Father Francisco de Avila is returned at this time, having spent the last year and a half enduring tortures which left his body so twisted and his skin so scarred, no one in Saint Augustine could recognize the man. For Don Juan, Governor Mendez found no peace for the man. He hires the chief of the Asio, a Gullah tribe, to track down Don Juan. It would take a year, but the chief found Don Juan and his followers living among the Yusafingue, a Gullah town more inland than most of them. The chief of the Asio leads 500 warriors to the town, which had a protective palisade around it. It would take 2 attempts, but the chief would eventually overwhelm the Yusafingue and round up Don Juan and his followers, killing them all. The chief then delivered Don Juan's scalp to the governor, and forever afterwards, the Spanish would remember Don Juan as Juanillo, the diminutive term for Juan, like Johnny for John, and his movement was forever remembered as Juanillo's Revolt, forever mocking the man for his violence towards the Franciscans, but otherwise unimpressive showing when facing men of war. It would become clear to all at this point that Governor Mendez is not a man to be messed with. He will defeat your movement. He will have you hunted down. He will hang your scalp upon his mantle, and he will even make sure your memory is wrapped up in an insult. From here, the relationship between the Spanish and the native groups that acknowledged their supremacy would change a bit. Again, the corn tribute disappeared, and instead the Spanish expected a labor tribute, known as the repartimento system, wherein chiefs would send their people to work on building projects and farms in Saint Augustine. In return, the chiefs would receive gifts. This system allowed the natives to have more autonomy than the encomienda system used in other parts of the Spanish New World, and resembled a feudal system of labor that the Spanish knew well. These were different times than our own, of course. Turning away from native affairs, in 1599, St. Augustine faced a number of devastating fires and then a very devastating hurricane. This was the only substantial settlement of Spaniards in so-called Spanish Florida, having around 625 residents. The nearby native mission, called San Sebastian, fared far worse during the hurricane and was completely destroyed. Many died. Governor Mendez took this as an opportunity to completely rebuild St. Augustine with proper planning and design, whereas previously the city had grown in a haphazard fashion, as any city does when allowed to grow outward naturally, rather than in surveyed streets and specific zones. And so, while Pedro Menendez is often credited with founding St. Augustine, it would be Governor Mendez who designed the core of it, which to some degree still survives in the layout of the older parts of the city today. The governor taxed the residents whose properties survived the storm, then used his soldiers, the native labor system, and his population of crown slaves to rebuild the city. Yes, Spanish Florida had slavery. In this case, crown slaves were technically owned by the king and were used to work on public service projects. The hurricane also shifted the sandbars of St. Augustine, and now the harbor proved to be overall even more shallow than before and more dangerous to navigate. St. Augustine will continue to be a well-protected inlet, but a poor excuse for a seaport. There wasn't much the governor could do about this. But on matters of food, he encouraged the Floridanos to grow more of their own food supply, so as to be less dependent on natives and supplies from places like Cuba. He also standardized the local system of weights and measures. He builds the first horse-drawn grist mill in the colony to relieve the women of the colony the task of grinding the corn by hand. But all of this may have mattered little, as officials back in Spain began a long and serious conversation about abandoning Florida altogether. The Spanish Empire was now at the end of a long and lucrative phase of its expansion, beginning in 1492. For decades, the treasure fleets of Spain returned gold and silver from the New World, and would continue to do so for some time, but the era of expansion and plunder was just about over. And now the Spanish New World entered a new phase of maintaining and governing what it had already conquered, and now, especially after 1588, defending what it already possessed. As such, colonies that were actually costing the crown money were now on the chopping block. Places like New Mexico and, yes, Florida, which had yet to become self-sustaining. The entire point of the mercantilist colonial system is to enrich the mother country, not drain on it with subsidies. Colonies can also serve to spread out excess population. Florida, being underpopulated, would be a candidate for such purposes. But the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, in his chapter in the collaborative work Spain: A History, points out that Spain itself, from 1590 until about 1610, faced waves of plagues, especially in the big cities. Having a surplus population really wasn't much of a problem, and those who did wish to move out to the colonies could find far greater opportunities in almost any other colony than Florida. Governors and other authorities in Florida very much wished for the colony to continue, and would always stress that Florida was a defensive outpost. The Roanoke colony had come and gone, but French traders still trolled the coastline. The natives liked these traders, for whom they could get European goods without having to submit to Spanish rule and provide tribute. And at any time, these Frenchmen could set up another colony, like the former Charles Fort or Fort Caroline. In 1598, Spaniards traveling near Stone Mountain, Georgia, reported a testimony given by a local chief of a settlement of Europeans who had bushy beards and used metal tools. Historians still debate to this day who, if anyone, this report actually detailed. It may have been the Roanoke survivors, or even enclaves of earlier Spanish colonists, for which there were potentially more than ever there were English at Roanoke. And of course, the chief could have always just been telling the Spaniards a tale they found interesting. We don't know. Either way, these reports would be forwarded to Spain to underscore the importance of the Florida colony. Then in 1602, the crown sent Fernando de Valdez, the son of the governor of Cuba, to Florida to make a comprehensive report on the colony of Florida in person and ultimately recommend its continuation or its abandonment. This is after years of covertly gathering opinions from other colonial governors and the Viceroy of New Spain on the issue, who more or less saw nothing of value in Florida. He made depositions of many in the colony who, of course, wished for the colony to continue. The clergy cited the saving of souls, and the governor cited new rumors of mines in the hills of Apalachicola as reasons why the colony should persist. The governor even proposed building a road to New Mexico, creating a land route linking Florida to the rest of the continental empire, and earlier requested 1,000 soldiers to be marched up the East Coast and clear the land of interloping Europeans. He wanted to really prove the point that Florida had value to the empire. In fact, Florida itself was in decent shape at the turn of the century. In 1595, it owed half of its upcoming Situado, the subsidy, to merchants in Havana. But here in 1602, Florida had almost an entire year's Situado in reserve, and the colony was in the process of rebuilding its influence and expanding. In 1603, Governor Mendez tours Wale country. He has chapels built or rebuilt, and the Franciscans followed. With the governor's term nearly spent, it can be said that Mendez left Florida in far better condition than he found it. His replacement was Pedro de Ibarra, whose arrival was somewhat delayed by his capture by pirates, who kindly deposited him off on the island of Cuba, for which he was able to then sail to Florida. Governor Mendez sold his personal mansion to the crown so that the site would serve as an official state residence for future governors. And although the structure from his time has been replaced, you can still visit the government house of Saint Augustine to this day. And in a final testament to the power of Mendez, the new governor is visited by 40 chiefs to pay homage over the next year, up from the 24 or so from when Mendez first arrived. When a governor finishes his term, he undergoes an investigation into his conduct during his tenure. One blemish was a single incident of Mendez trying to fill a vacancy with an underqualified relative. And then a larger mark was his attempt to monopolize the markets of St. Augustine to his merchant nephew. We shouldn't whitewash our characters. Future governors would not fare nearly as well as Mendez does here upon inspection. For the founding extended Menendez family in St. Augustine, the new governor Ibarra was a particular nuisance from the get-go, as they wished for Dona Catalina Menendez's new husband, Hernando de las Alas, to become the new governor. Catalina was the daughter of the founder, Pedro Menendez, and Las Alas himself had family among the officials of the colony. She argued her father's will allowed her to select the governor of Florida. But the crown disagreed, citing the fact that this was satisfied when her first husband, Hernando de Miranda, briefly served as governor until he ran off with the Situado. Florida was now a crown colony and not a proprietary colony. Now, usually when the resident officials hated a governor, he could lean on the religious authorities to counterbalance their influence. But Governor Ibarra became an out-and-out enemy to the Franciscans, who insisted on telling him how the natives were to be interacted with, when at least according to the Spanish, all of these tribes were Spanish subjects living in Spanish provinces. Governor Ibarra toured the native towns and distributed gifts himself. He saw no need for the Franciscans to incessantly meddle in their civil issues, and at one point he reportedly berated a chief, reminding him that, "I am your governor, the friars are not." And when the governor found no allies among the civil officials nor the religious class, he could often find a support base among the large group of military men serving in the garrison for support. St. Augustine, again, was essentially a military town. The Situado subsidy paid the salary of the soldiers, and that money was spent in the markets of the town, keeping everything afloat. That made them an influential bunch of people. But Governor Ibarra upset the soldiers when he created a personal monopoly on the export of sassafras and amber from the colony through his approved merchant. Now, soldiers often supplemented their pay by working on farms, doing construction projects, and trading with the natives for things like amber and sassafras. They could then resell that, of course, for a profit. Now only the governor's man could buy from the natives, and any exported amber or sassafras had to go through him. And so the governor became unpopular even among the soldiers. The governor's merchant, of course, also fixed the price to sell these goods to himself because he essentially created a one-buyer market, and so even the natives began to resent the man. But again, the colony had larger, more existential problems. A peace made between Spain and England in 1604 gave English merchant adventurers the opportunity to once again consider a colony in the New World. The next year, the governor sent out Captain Francisco Fernandez de Ejeta to search the East Coast for traders and colonies. He goes as far north as Cape Fear in North Carolina today, and he finds no Europeans. However, in that same year, the governor continued to capture French Huguenot traders found among the natives, a persistent problem since the fall of French Florida. These men were all slated for execution. A visiting bishop, Bishop Altamirano, did his best to convert these men to Catholicism. They were Huguenots, of course, meaning they were French Protestants, typically of the Calvinist variety. All but one turned to Catholicism, and then all of them, regardless, were executed. The bishop's visit was an exciting one for Saint Augustine, as it seemed to validate the importance of Spanish Florida within the empire. In the same year, the local friars opened a seminary school, the first of its kind in what would become the continental United States. Then in the very next year, 1606, the crown actually rebukes Cuban authorities on behalf of Florida for obstructing agents trying to obtain supplies for Florida and charging inflated prices. Additionally, they allowed the Floridanos to legally trade to a wider selection of ports to obtain supplies, where previously they were limited to a small selection of what was called privileged ports, such as Havana and Veracruz. It seemed as if Florida had suddenly gained recognition for its merits and potential, and yet the King of Spain made a decree in February of 1607 that the fort outside of Saint Augustine should be destroyed and the garrison redistributed throughout the Caribbean. He also said that the native Catholic population should be offered new homes on the island of Hispaniola. Without saying it directly, this was a full retreat from Florida. Now, St. Augustine around this time had 370 Europeans, mostly Spanish with some Portuguese and French and a few Germans and Flemish folks, along with reportedly 2,074 Catholic natives living in the St. Augustine area and the outside provinces. The majority of the married soldiers were married to native women. The people there wished to stay, and they were now 3 generations deep into forming their own unique Latin American Floridano population with a mestizo element. Hispaniola or Cuba were nice places, but each were unique in their ways, just as any Latin American nation is today to any other. And after all, there's no place like home, right? The governor received the order late into the year 1607, and he finally found some common ground with the rest of Spanish Florida by simply and respectfully balking at the order. The Franciscans are credited as having argued for the continuance of Florida for the sake of saving souls. For this reason and one other, the king actually reverses his order and decides to continue on with Florida in August of 1608. The other reason is revealed by a command given to the governor at this time: find Jamestown. Yes, the Spanish knew well that the English colony of Jamestown existed somewhere along the North American coast. It would now be the mission of the Floridanos to find it. Of course, the last place they would think to look would be in the Chesapeake, where many years before, the natives, led by a man named Juanillo, slaughtered a Jesuit mission. Surely, the Spanish thought the English would not be welcomed there. In keeping with the theme of this podcast, our next episode will not focus on Jamestown, but rather Juanillo's people, who today we refer to as the Powhatan. Until next time, this has been the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.